United States flew strategic bombers over the Persian Gulf on Wednesday for the second time this month, a show of force meant to deter Iran from attacking American or allied targets in the Middle East. One senior U.S. military officer said the flight by two Air Force B-52 bombers was in response to signals that Iran may be planning attacks against U.S. allied targets in neighboring Iraq or elsewhere in the region in coming days, even as President-elect Joe Biden prepares to take office. The officer was not authorized to publicly discuss internal assessments based on sensitive intelligence and spoke on condition of anonymity. The B-52 bomber mission, flown round-trip from an Air Force base in North Dakota, reflects growing concern in Washington, in the final weeks of President Donald Trump's administration, that Iran will order further military retaliation for the U.S. killing last January 3 of top Iranian military commander General Qasem Soleimani. Iran's initial response, 5 days after the deadly U.S. drone strike, was a ballistic missile attack on a military base in Iraq that caused brain concussion injuries to about 100 U.S. troops. Iran, however, has appeared wary of Trump's intentions in his final weeks in office, given his focus on pressuring Tehran with sanctions and other moves that have further damaged the Islamic Republic's economy. Trump will bear full responsibility for any adventurism on his way out. Adding to the tension was a December 20th rocket attack on the U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad by Iranian-supported Shiite militia groups. No one was killed, but the volume of rockets fired, possibly 21, with about 9 landing on the embassy compound, was unusually large. Days later, Trump tweeted that Iran was on notice. Because of the potential for escalation that could lead to a wider war, the U.S. has sought to deter Iran from additional attacks. Strategic calculations on both sides are further complicated by the political transition in Washington to a Biden administration that may seek new paths to dealing with Iran. Biden has said, for example, that he hopes to return the U.S. to a 2015 agreement with world powers in which Iran agreed to limit its nuclear activities in exchange for the lifting of international sanctions. In announcing Wednesday's bomber flight, the head of U.S. Central Command said it was a defensive move. The United States continues to deploy combat-ready capabilities into the U.S. Central Command area of responsibility to deter any potential adversary, and make clear that U.S. ready and able to respond to any aggression directed at Americans or U.S. interests. In advance of the announcement, the senior U.S. military officer who spoke on condition of anonymity said that U.S. intelligence has detected recent signs of fairly substantive threats from Iran, and that included planning for possible rocket attacks against U.S. interests in Iraq in connection with the one-year anniversary of the Soleimani killing. The U.S. is in the process of reducing its troop presence in Iraq from 3,000 to about 2,500. Trump ordered that the reduction be achieved by January 15. Officials say it is likely to be reached as early as next week. The United States also has picked up signs that Iran may be considering or planning more complex and broader attacks against American targets or interests in the Middle East, the senior U.S. military officer said, adding that it represented the most concerning signs since the days immediately following the Soleimani killing. The officer cited indications that advanced weaponry has been flowing from Iran into Iraq recently and that Shiite militia leaders in Iraq may have met with officers of Iran's Quds Force, previously commanded by Soleimani. The U.S. officer said Iran might have its eye on economic targets, noting the September 2019 missile and drone attack on Saudi oil processing facilities. Iran denied involvement but was blamed by the United States for that attack. In recent weeks, the US military has taken a range of steps designed to deter Iran, while publicly emphasizing that it is not planning, and has not been instructed, to take unprovoked action against Iran. Last week, a U.S. Navy-guided missile submarine made an unusual transit of the Strait of Hormuz, the strategic waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. Earlier in December, a pair of B-52 bombers from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana flew what the military calls a presence mission over the Gulf, a demonstration of U.S. force and a signal of U.S. commitment to the region, but not an attack mission. That flight was repeated this week, with two B-52s flying non-stop from Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota and heading home Wednesday after cruising over the western side of the Gulf. Tensions with Iran escalated with the killing in November of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, an Iranian scientist named by the West as the leader of the Islamic Republic's disbanded military nuclear program. Iran has blamed Israel for the killing, but U.S. officials are concerned that any Iranian retaliation could hit U.S. interests. Other sources say on New Year's Eve last year, a mob attacked the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. No Americans were hurt, but a quick reaction force of U.S. Marines was flown in from Kuwait to bolster security after the perimeter of the embassy was damaged in the unrest. Days later, on January 3rd, an American drone orbiting over Baghdad's international airport killed Iranian Quds Force commander Maj. General Qasem Soleimani along with Iranian-backed militia leader Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Top U.S. military officials said Soleimani was responsible for killing hundreds of American troops during the Iraq War. They said Soleimani was also responsible for a spate of rocket attacks against U.S. bases and the embassy in Iraq. Last week, the guided missile submarine USS Georgia, armed with up to 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles and a dry deck shelter for Navy SEALs, entered the Persian Gulf, according to the Navy's Fifth Fleet. It was the first public announcement of a guided missile submarine transiting the Strait of Hormuz off the coast of Iran into the Gulf in 8 years. Escorting the submarine were the cruisers Port Royal and Philippine Sea, also armed with dozens of cruise missiles each. The guided missile destroyer John Paul Jones is also on patrol in the Persian Gulf. The aircraft carrier USS Nimitz is currently off the coast of Somalia in the Indian Ocean, but could steam back north to the Arabian Sea to launch attacks from its dozens of F-18 Super Hornets, if needed, the senior military official said. Last month, a squadron of American F-16 jet fighters from Germany arrived at Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates. The goal of the bomber flights, as well as the increased American firepower in the Persian Gulf in recent days, is to deter Iran for the purpose of sending them a clear signal that should they decide to take action against U.S. forces and U.S. have the capability to respond.